Hi everyone, this is Phil Travis, and this is our last presentation of the term. It's on the Cold War, its origins, and how decolonization factored into the Cold War in the developing world. So decolonization as a term means how areas in Africa, areas in Asia, for example, were able to gain independence and separate themselves from colonial powers. And as we've been looking at in this course from the 19th century on, we saw how European powers imperialized or colonized and imperialized the world. And we saw how nationalism and imperialism factored into the First World War, in the Second World War, and in the aftermath of the Second World War, as the Cold War comes to embody the international relations of the world. It serves as a battleground, basically, for lots and lots of developing world countries to fight and vie for their independence. And of course, the Cold War, which is basically a standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, the two major superpowers in the aftermath of the Second World War. These small revolutionary movements and groups, like in Vietnam, for example, all vied for the support of one or the other of these great superpowers. So, very interesting lesson this week, and I hope you enjoy it.
So when you ask what the Cold War is, there's some basic definitions here. I'm just going to put this stuff up here for you guys. So at its most basic level, it's a standoff between two superpowers, the United States and the USSR. I'll show you a map in just a little bit. But these two empires, these two superpowers, create spheres of influence and vie for control and influence throughout the world, particularly in the developing world and in Central Europe. Walter Lefebvre, it says, what does Lefebvre say? Walter Lefebvre is a very famous historian who had argued that the Cold War was effectively a collision of two empires. That the U.S. empire was driven by a pursuit of open markets going back to the 1800s, and the Soviet empire was driven for a landed political control and an insulation ultimately from capitalist influence. So it's a global conflict. It's an indirect global conflict. That is, we call it a Cold War because that means it's not a shooting war. And it is true that the two major superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, never fought, but they did compete for areas throughout the globe, and particularly in the developing world. They got involved in revolutions and tried to manipulate those revolutions to their own end. So in that respect, it's a period of almost continuous bloody war, overthrown governments, assassinations, guerrilla war, the whole, and even the threat of nuclear war at a number of times obviously occurs during the Cold War. The picture you see here is Churchill, Truman, and Stalin at Potsdam, which was a conference in July of 1945. This was the conference where Truman knew the U.S. had the bomb, and this is the conference really where the United States is trying to make decisions about what to do in Japan. And Truman and Stalin did not hit it off. Unlike FDR, who attempted to compromise with Stalin a little bit more, Truman drew more of a hard line with Stalin. And the relationship between Stalin and Truman it became icy rather quickly, and that factored into the development of the Cold War. Stalin also found out that Truman had told Churchill about the bomb, the atomic bomb, but had withheld it from him. He actually found out through espionage. And, of course, that created distrust between the two. But at the Potsdam Conference, Truman and Stalin begin to take differing opinions when it comes to what happens in Eastern Europe and Germany at the end of the war, which was very significant as well. The causes of the Cold War are really economics, capitalism versus communism, right? Capitalism, the pursuit of open free markets, global free markets, global capitalism, global trade, versus communism, which was a planned economic system that largely saw capitalism as its undoing. and vice versa as well. Um, Strategic interests, national security interests. You'll see that in the map I'm going to show you next, the United States and the Soviet Union create massive spheres of influence in the world, and they create these spheres of influence to vie for and protect their national security and their strategic interests in the globe. Ideology, communism and United States capitalist democracy, two different ideologies. One perceived as one perceived, for example, as atheist, the other perceived as religious. One perceived as centered on free market capitalism and individualism, the other perceived as centered on planned economies and collectivism. So opposite ideologies, and ideologies which with both sides see as fundamentally in um, um, endangering the other, shall we say. And also leadership. Truman and Stalin, the actual decisions of leaders mattered too. And the decisions of a very paranoid Joseph Stalin and the decisions of a Harry Truman who really wanted to draw a line and show that he meant business. In a lot of respects, their decisions over things like the atomic bomb, over over what happened with Germany at the end of the war, were very significant in the development of the Cold War. So here's a look at basically this is 1980, in the Cold War 1980s. This is a look at the spheres of influence that were created by the two. And of course, some countries, like India, for example, fell into something called the non-aligned movement. But lots and lots of these, as you look at the map, you can see the whole of the developing world, much of which would have been involved in colonial struggles, also gets involved in the Cold War, as the United States tries to use its sphere of influence to protect free markets, protect the U.S. way of life, and the Soviet Union tries to insulate itself from the free market economy by expanding its influence and consolidating its power in places it does influence. Scholars don't exactly agree on when the Cold War began. I hesitate to say that actually. Scholars generally feel that when you look at the beginning of the Cold War, that the actual Cold War begins in either 1945 or 1947. But some scholars trace the roots longer. Walter Lefebvre, for example, traces the roots back to late 19th century imperial expansion on the part of the United States and ultimately of Tsarist Russia. And of course, the Bolshevik Revolution, which I'll mention in just a second. Most scholars will say it either happened at the end of World War II. John Lewis Gaddis is one of the famous who interprets it that way. Gaddis believes that the Soviet Union and the United States were completely incompatible. And when World War II ends and Europe's destroyed, it kind of brought the two together in the vacuum, making the Cold War effectively inevitable. Many scholars, and the position that I agree with the most, is that the Cold War really begins in 1947 with the development, and this is Thomas Patterson, and this is with the development of the Truman Doctrine, with containment policy as a whole, with the acceptance of a U.S. policy that they had to oppose the Soviet Union, and vice versa, the Soviet Union reacting to that. But many would also trace it back to the Bolsheviks. By contrast, Woodrow Wilson had a competing vision of a new world order of free market, open trade, capitalist democracy in the world. Wilson actually, shortly after, or at the end of Wilson's presidency, there was a Red Scare in the United States. He sent something like 10,000 people to fight in the Bolshevik Revolution. And the United States didn't recognize the Soviet Union until 1933. And of course, yes, it was 1917, 1918 when the communists, led by Lenin, took power in Russia and created the Soviet Union. So there's these competing visions that are fundamentally at the heart of the origins of the Cold War. And you see as well just how the Cold War was almost inevitably going to involve the decolonization of the world, or going to be involved in the decolonization of the world. meaning that you have one vision that says his goal effectively is world communist revolution, and he influenced people like Ho Chi Minh in places like Vietnam. Wilson, on the other hand, wants an open world. He also wants an end to colonialism, but he wants an open, free market world. And so you can see they both have visions, and this is behind, at the heart of the United States in the 20th century and the USSR in the 20th century, are these competing visions for what will happen in the developing world, what will happen amid decolonization. Another factor in the origins of the Cold War were reactions to what was known as the lessons, or what were known as the lessons of Munich. The Munich conference in 1938 was the moment when the Allies had appeased Hitler. They gave Hitler half of Czechoslovakia, so-called Sudetenland. And after that, American policymakers, British policymakers, Western leaders went to great lengths to not appease an aggressor again, to oppose any kind of threat that they believed could be similar to the threat posed by Hitler, which was not often the case in the 20th century, as a matter of fact. But this gave rise to the domino theory. And the domino theory was this idea in the Cold War that you had to stop the advance of communism in one place, and if you didn't, you could lose an entire region to communism without even thinking, without even blinking your eye, because this is what they perceived as happening at the beginning of World War II. They appeased Hitler, and then before you know it, Hitler had invaded all of Eastern Europe and France. And they wanted to avoid this. And so you have this almost like paranoid kind of reactionary approach that says you have to fight communism, whether it's a revolutionary movement, whether it's part of a decolonization war, or whether it's in Germany. You've got to fight it all the same. Otherwise, it's going to conquer whole regions before you know it. That really embodied the United States' general perspective on the Cold War. And of course, Stalin, the Cold War also happened. There's an Eastern perspective too. Stalin very much was fearful of the intentions of the West. That was one of his motivations of the Munich conference. In a lot of respects, you start to see the Cold War take shape in February and March of 1946, when you see coming out of the Soviet Union, you see the statement that Marxist and Leninist ideals were valid for the unevenness of the development of the capitalist countries, meaning that Marxism and Leninism had to kind of strike a balance. That in the West, that statement was taken to mean that the Soviet Union was going to try to promote revolution in the world. Similarly, Churchill's infamous or famous statement in Missouri, Winston Churchill's famous statement in Missouri in March, that an iron curtain had descended, and the suggestion that God had willed the atomic bomb to the United States. These types of statements between the East and the West really helped to crystallize the Cold War. We're going to talk about Vietnam in just a moment, so don't worry about that Iran and Turkey bit. If you want to look up Iran and Turkey at the beginning of the Cold War, go ahead and do it on your own. We're going to look at Vietnam, though, because we don't want to take up too much time. The big question, one of the big questions at the end of World War II, and one that carried tremendously significant for the world, not only in the 40s, but still today, as nuclear proliferation is a massive problem in the world today. The United States had an atomic monopoly. Eastern Europe and Eastern Germany are occupied at this time. And so the issue is, how do you solve these problems? And what happens is very bad for the development of the Cold War. The United States will keep an atomic weapons monopoly, and the Soviet Union and the United States will engage in an arms race over it. And this helps fuel nuclear proliferation in the modern day. Eastern Europe will be occupied by the Soviet Union. Germany will be divided, and both sides will militarize the area, creating a situation that was almost ready for war. And this is a look at the numbers. There are amounts of troops. The United States is going to keep the nuclear monopoly. We're going to form something called NATO. The Soviet Union is going to form the Warsaw Pact and go to great lengths to develop their own atomic weapons. And by 1949, after the Soviets have their own atomic weapon, the United States and the USSR engage themselves in an intensive nuclear arms race, and of course, huge militarizations and military buildup across Europe. In 1946 and 47, Europe was decimated. We have to remember this. And the United States was very fearful of losing Western Europe to communism. This is another factor in the development of the Cold War. And so, in order to prevent this, the United States took several actions. There was conflicts being fought in Greece, in Turkey. There were communist movements in France and Italy. Their economies were very much damaged, and so they were particularly ripe for the development of legitimate communist movements, which the United States perceived as fundamentally opposed to the interests of the United States and of freedom in the world. The United States takes a couple of important steps in 1946 and 47 that really result in the development of the Cold War. One was the Truman Doctrine and also the Marshall Plan. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan most specifically were statements basically that the United States would fight to contain communism, but that they would fight primarily through aid, through economic aid. And the Marshall Plan was an upwards of $16 billion aid program to Western Europe. And all the little bars on your map there of the green countries are all meant to signify how much of the Marshall Plan aid the United States sent to those countries, or those countries received. The United States developed the containment policy, which was a policy to economically but also militarily contain the Soviet Union until they are prepared to live in peace with the West. And then eventually by 1950, the policy becomes until the Soviet Union collapses effectively. So in response to the bleak situation in Europe, the response to communist movements in Eastern Europe, the Soviet refusal to get out of Eastern Germany and Poland, the Soviet attempt to move into other areas of the world. The United States saw the movements in Greece and Turkey, as well as Iran, as being movements that were being fueled by the Soviet Union. They saw the communist or the Soviet Union as on the move. It's a direct quote. They were viewed as on the move everywhere at this time. And so those reactions, those created reactions from the West that led to the development of the Cold War, particularly with the Marshall Plan and containment policy, using economic aid but also military options to contain communism, as that last map showed you, the militarization of Europe. Other developments for U.S. policy, the National Securities Act of 1947 created the Defense Department, the CIA, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the National Security Council. The draft was resumed. And these, of course, really creates the national security apparatus of the United States today. And for practical purposes, marks the origin of what we might call the military-industrial complex, which is of great significance when you think about United States domestic policy, but also United States policy in the world, more broadly speaking, today. I want to look at one example, and this is the example of Vietnam. One example of the Cold War as it involved itself in decolonization. The map you see here is of French Indochina, the colonized area of Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, which was broken up into three parts by the French, Tonkin, Annam, and Cochin China. At the end of World War II, Ho Chi Minh declared the independence of Vietnam. He quoted the Star Spangled Banner. He had the band play the Star Spangled Banner. He quoted the Declaration of Independence. He was writing letters to Harry Truman, and he declared in August. He declared the independence of Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh was the Vietnamese nationalist leader. He had been inspired by Lenin. He tried to meet Woodrow Wilson. However, the French had, after World War II, the French were defeated, of course, and the French sought to reestablish their colony in Indochina. And this led to war primarily between the French and Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh guerrilla forces. Um, Containment in the 1940s was really limited to primary concern over strong point areas, Japan, Europe, for example. Vietnam was off the radar of Truman. Truman didn't really pay attention to Ho Chi Minh's letters. He didn't really have a policy. The United States in the late 40s didn't really think Vietnam mattered. But the United States took the position of supporting France in their attempt to recolonize Vietnam because we were so concerned. If you go back to the last slide on the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, we were so concerned about communism in Europe. We were so concerned about communism in Europe that we felt we had to support the French in what they wanted to do because we wanted a strong France, a pro-U.S. France. And so the United States kind of looks the other way when it comes to French recolonization of Vietnam. Of course, this results in a bloody colonial war, the French Indochina War. And ultimately, it becomes a war that the United States involves itself deeply in. In 1950, there had been a number of changes. China had fallen to communism. The Soviets had an atomic bomb. There were espionage crises in the United States. The Korean War happened in the winter of 1950. The United States, at that time, makes the decision to globalize containment. And containment becomes no longer about containing the Soviets in Europe and hoping that eventually you can create compromise. Instead, containment becomes the idea that you had to fight communism anywhere in the globe at any time. And this leads largely to the struggle, an active struggle between the U.S. and the Soviets in the decolonizing world, the developing world where states are fighting to free themselves from colonial powers. By the early 1950s, the French won out of Vietnam, but the United States actually wanted them to stay and was largely paying for their war, which had become tremendously expensive. And that was because the United States we weren't trying to colonize Vietnam. The United States was trying to contain communism, but in the process had become embroiled in a colonial war. So the French Indochina War ended with the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. It's on the top corner of the map there. When the French are defeated by the forces led by Vo Nguyen Giap, who was Ho Chi Minh's primary leader, primary general. And after the French are defeated here by the Vietnamese, led by Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap and Pham Van Dong, after that happens, there's peace talks in Geneva. They actually had begun during the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, but the peace talks ultimately agree to a ceasefire. The country was temporarily partitioned with a line north and south, and then there would be elections in 2 years to reunify the country. And the United States was there, but the United States was not happy. We did not sign. We refused to actually recognize the Chinese government that was there, as well as the Vietnamese representatives. And we're present, but we don't sign anything. And that's because the United States knows that if there are elections within 2 years, that Ho Chi Minh will win those elections. And so the United States goes to great length after this point to support a competitor government, a new government in South Vietnam, and use that government as a way of containing communism in Southeast Asia. We really believed in the domino theory that we had to stop communism in South Vietnam, otherwise we'd have the same fate that occurred with the Munich crisis of 1938, the domino theory. So the United States will refuse to hold elections, and now the French are out, and the United States comes in not as a colonial power, but as a power that's trying to fight communism. And we support and pretty much create as a leader No Dinh Diem, who's pictured here. The United States with Diem refused to hold elections. After Diem refuses to hold elections, the northern government ultimately will decide, largely in response to an aggressive war against the communists in South Vietnam, led by No Dinh Diem, the North will begin a war of reunification again. And the United States' policy is that they're going to consolidate strength in the South and contain communist advances. Mind you, this is all happening. This is in the midst of what's going on in Vietnam is really more nationalist, more decolonial than it is communist. But the United States' Cold War perspective interprets it fundamentally as rooted in the issue of communism, rather than the issue of nationalism, rather than in the issue of decolonization. We interpret Ho Chi Minh as effectively a pawn of the Soviet Union, and that's the motivating factor for our thinking in this war, which is very problematic, actually. If you guys get a chance, take a look at that link, and I think you'll find it interesting. It's a nice little introduction to a really good documentary on Vietnam, and you hear the domino theory quite a lot in there. So if you want, take a look at that. You can hear the kind of domino theory rhetoric at work. The reason why we had to fight in Vietnam was to prevent global communism in an entire region in this case. So the policy of the United States, just to kind of sum up here, the United States kind of slides into what becomes a quagmire. We start with providing advisors and economic support for the Southern government that we pretty much created, but the government wasn't a puppet government, but it was pretty much created by the United States. But we begin with advisors, development programs, economic investment, military aid. We build up the South Vietnamese military to a point where they were one of the largest militaries in the world. But ultimately, the United States, as the ability to fight the communists in the South, proves just incredibly problematic. Through the South Vietnamese ally, the United States Americanizes the troops and Americanizes the conflict by sending U.S. combat troops in 1965. And by 1969, American combat troops had gotten to as high as 500,000. The war becomes a war of attrition. Like the primary goal in the American Vietnam War was to kill the enemy. Now, you might think, oh, well, that's obvious. Well, not actually the case. In most traditional wars and conventional wars, the goal is to, yes, you kill enemy, but the goal is to take an area, to secure a part of the countryside, to take a city, to cut off ports, to fight strategic battles with your enemy. In Vietnam, the goal was literally to kill as many enemy as you could and count the number of them and then leave the area that you just fought in. It became a war that was largely focused on the ability for you to kill more of the enemy than the enemy could use to resupply their operations. So it's attriting the enemy. It's a way of, we believe that we could exert such casualties on the enemy that they would be unable to continue the war. And that was a very, very difficult policy to carry through, and it ultimately fails. And in a lot of cases, the conflict became a very destructive and kind of, what's the best word? It becomes a battle that's very difficult for American troops because they're not taking territories. They're not taking territory. They're not taking land. They're fighting in the same places over and over again. And it's not only a difficult reality for the American troops, but it's also incredibly devastating on the Vietnamese people. There's many civilians that are killed and chalked up as the enemy. There's unarmed civilians that are killed often. Villages are burned down. It becomes a brutal and bloody war of attrition that kind of just really goes nowhere in a lot of respects. And this had all rooted from American containment policy that was really born out of the Cold War, but involved itself fundamentally in wars of decolonization. When you look at the consequences, they're really massive. Most historians regard Vietnam as a tragic mistake that was caused by U.S. Cold War policy. U.S. Cold War policy said that you effectively had to fight communism at any place in the world, and that effectively that communist threat, regardless of where it was at, was the same as though it were directly being carried out by the Soviet Union. And so Fidel Castro or Ho Chi Minh or any other communist revolutionary that you can think of, the United States generally interpreted less from the ground of decolonization, less from the grounds of nationalism and civil war, and more from the ground of communism and global communism. And this caused the United States in Vietnam um, to exaggerate what was happening on the ground in Vietnam, that it was a nationalist war, that it was a war to end colonialism, and the consequences for people is horrible. 60,000 United States people were killed, roughly. At least 1 million Vietnamese dead. The actual environment of Vietnam is decimated. The United States bombed something like 60% of the countryside in South Vietnam. Agent Orange was a chemical agent, horribly carcinogenic, that was sprayed in millions of gallons on South Vietnam to defoliate the trees. They bombed heavily. More bombs were dropped in Vietnam by the United States than all theaters of World War II combined. There was a genocide in Cambodia. Cambodia became increasingly um, swallowed up in the war as the United States and the Vietnamese fought in border areas of Cambodia, and it led to a civil war in Cambodia that ultimately, after the war, resulted in the Cambodian genocide. It created economic problems in the United States. It led to horrible political crisis in the United States. That was one of the first real kind of downturns in terms of American perspective of their government was a result of Vietnam. It became associated. The United States largely became associated with corruption after Vietnam, um, but at least the Nixon administration and the Johnson administration. But Vietnam, the United States had gotten involved in what was really more of a colonial war than it was a war of global communism, and that was a tragic mistake. And unfortunately, these types of things play out in other ways throughout the developing world during the Cold War, as the world decolonizes in Africa, in Southeast Asia, as you have similar nationalist wars fought in Latin America. You will again see the United States and the Soviet Union fighting directly and indirectly in these areas to try to manipulate the outcome in the interest of global national security and global strategic interest. Okay, well, I hope that kind of made sense. Let me know if you have any questions, guys.